Turning now to domestic politics, the government does shut down today at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. No end in sight. Now, currently, it does look like that's where things are going. Of course, things could change. There was a high-stakes meeting at the White House immediately after Prime Minister Netanyahu left. The House Democratic Majority Leader and House Democratic Leader Senate Leader Chuck Schumer came to the White House for a quote negotiation, where basically the Trump White House told them, give us what we want, or you're going to shut down the government. The Democrats effectively said the same thing. Immediately afterwards, both sides kind of came to the microphone to lay out their view of everything that's going on. Here was the Republican response from the Vice President, J.D. Vance. Let's take a listen.
We just had a very frank conversation with the Senate and House Democratic leadership. Look, the principle at stake here is very simple. We have disagreements about tax policy, but you don't shut that government down. We have disagreements about health care policy, but you don't shut the government down. You don't use your policy disagreements as leverage to not pay our troops, to not have essential services of government actually function.
All right, so yeah. That's
funny to hear Republicans take that position now. Okay. Everybody, yeah.
Everybody says it when they're in power. I don't even know what to say. I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. That's what every executive has always said about a government shutdown. Yeah. And what the opposition has always said, that is precisely the point of actually using your leverage of power. But anyways, here was Chuck Schumer, what he had to say in terms of what he laid out. Let's take a listen.
We laid out to the president some of the consequences of what's happening in healthcare. And by his face and by the way he looked, I think he heard about them for the first time. The closing of rural hospitals, the fact that so many clinics are closing. And I don't know if he knew this before, but the fact that people will pay $4,000 more a year, $400 more a month, close to $5,000 more a year on their health care premiums if we don't do anything. And people don't know what to do. The average working family can't afford that. I told him how I met a mother who was crying to me because her daughter had cancer. And what has happened with health care, with what they have done, she's going to watch her daughter suffer and maybe die. And so he seemed to, for the first time, understand the magnitude of this crisis. And we hope he'll talk to the Republican leaders and tell them we need bipartisan input on health care, on rescissions into their bill. Their bill does not have they never talk to us. Thune didn't negotiate with me. Johnson didn't negotiate with Hakeem. And on the key issues, the Appropriations Committee, which has talked about 3 of the smaller bills, they're good bills, they said the appropriators couldn't agree and said, kick it up to the 4 leaders. They still haven't talked.
So there you go. The Democrats are centering here on health care and some of the consequences of the one big, beautiful bill. But as we extensively discussed yesterday, they kind of backed their way into this. Basically, the base wants a shutdown, so they're going to shut down. So what they did is they poll tested their best messages, and they said, this is what we're going to shut down the government about. And look, I mean, you know, kind of smart. It's what the Republicans did in 2013 and elsewhere, and it does set up the stakes for some sort of high-stakes negotiations. The ultimate question, though, and that's where my money was, is will Chuck Schumer cave? And yesterday, he looked pretty close to caving. Let's put this up here on the screen just to give you all a little bit of a rundown of what happened. Initially, Chuck Schumer and his team came out and floated to the press that maybe what they would do is something called a 7 to 10 day CR. A CR is called a continuing resolution. What it would have done is continue to fund the government at the same levels for 7 to 10 days while they reach some sort of negotiation. However, immediately there was outrage from a lot of Democrats saying, oh my God, look, he's already caving. And so he came out and he said, actually, I won't support a 7 to 10 day CR. He also bashed media speculation about that trial balloon, which he literally floated himself, but let's all just move past that a little bit. The point remains that the government's probably going to shut down as of right now. Again, we're recording this in the morning. Things certainly could change and they could cave, but that's where things are going. So now it becomes more of a question about the politics of it. As we laid out extensively, the Democratic base wants to shut down. They just want Trump to suffer. The Republican base also kind of wants to shut down. What the Trump administration is setting themselves up for is they're like, hey, great, now we can just fire a ton of federal workers. They have total discretion discretionary authority. They could probably figure out a way to keep ICE and the military going. They don't care, right, about government services and the rest. They're like, cool, this is actually what we want to do. We didn't even want to fund the Department of Education. So it'd be kind of like a return to Doge almost in the initial days of the administration. And so that is kind of what I think is going to be the biggest sticking point for a lot of the Democrats who are institutionally in power because, you know, they're addicted to norms and to institutions and to bureaucrats. And so I don't know. It's going to be an interesting one. I don't know how this one's going to shake out.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to say about it. So first of all, it does feel like a bit of a role reversal because most of the shutdown fights have come from the Republican side, and they're the ones who really pioneered like the brinksmanship. It used to be just sort of automatic, like, of course you fund the government. Of course you're not going to just have the government shut down. There was another, you know, incident in the 90s, but by and large, it's been sort of like the modern Republican Party that has really pioneered this kind of like debt ceiling and government shutdown brinksmanship. And usually it's the Democrats who are out there warning, like, hey, if you do this, you're going to have all sorts of consequences, like things that people rely on for the federal government that are not going to be there for them. The longer that it goes on, the more tenuous those services become. So it's been kind of funny to watch like Mike Johnson go out and laud the importance of the federal government and all of these government programs. And, you know, at the same time as literally today, 100,000 federal government employees are resigning because of that. You guys remember back in the day, that fork in the road email? Yeah. So there was the deal then was basically you get to not work and get paid for a number of months. That time period has expired. So today is the day that 100,000 federal government employees are resigning and were essentially, you know, sort of like pressured to leave the government. So this has been a very radical administration in terms of destruction of core government functions. That's been a lot of what they've been about. Russ Vought, of course, as being one of the primary architects here. Elon Musk was the public face of it, obviously with Doge. But a lot of this work, even as Doge has faded into the background, has continued. And Russ Vought said very clearly, like, he wants to make government employees suffer. He wants to put pressure on them and get them to leave and force them out and cut their jobs and all of that. So that has been continuing apace. They see it, people on his side see this as another excuse to accelerate the stripping of government and the firing of government employees that, you know, they aren't particularly fond of to begin with. So at the same time that you got the Mike Johnsons of the world out there singing the praises of various federal government programs, behind the scenes, the actual work that is being done is to gut those programs and make them sort of fall apart.
Yeah, it is kind of ironic.
Yeah.
Because look, they obviously want to shut down. They would love, what do you think, what do we know about the first Trump administration or the second Trump administration? They love unilateral power, right? Well, the shutdown in a lot of ways, as I explained for the Obama administration, you have almost unilateral power in how to decide how to shut down. So for example, you get to decide who's essential and who is not. If you're not from DC, this is a fun game where people who are, quote, essential still have to come to work, whether they are being paid or not. Mm-hmm. But everybody who's not essential, you get to hang out. A lot of the bars around here do like shutdown happy hours. Let's be honest, a lot of the federal government employees like it because they get back pay and they don't have to work. And so what happens is that it kind of becomes this great game of the executive who gets to decide and not. This time around, they're like, listen, we're just going to fire people because it gives us authority to basically come in and say, well, in order to keep with the budget, et cetera, that's what we're going to do. Russ Vought, as you said, he's the budget director, actually went on Steve Bannon's show to lay some of this out. Let's take a listen.
I don't think anyone should be afraid of a government shutdown. I managed it for President Trump. We made it as painless as possible, consistent with the law. And it's actually what's necessary to pass these bills individually is because how else are you going to get moderates to vote for spending cuts if they're not up against the fact that they need to pass these things to get out of a shutdown themselves? So I think there should be no talk about a stopgap measure at this point. They need to be focused squarely on moving these bills.
So there you go. We're not afraid of a shutdown. They're going to use, so it's actually a question of politics. The politics of this initially are actually pretty interesting. Let's go ahead and put C6, please, up on the screen. So there was some initial polling that was released here that shows with the 48 hours to go, quote, Republicans haven't entirely won the blame game with voters. A new Morning Consult poll that was shared with Playbook reports that 45% of voters are more likely to blame Republicans if there's a shutdown compared to 32% blaming Democrats. That's some 13-point margin. The split does get wider when looking at independent voters who would be more likely to blame Republicans by a 17-point margin. This was some 2,000 voters that were surveyed last week. Quote, as is nearly always the case with shutdown, all parties will come out looking worse, at least for a brief period of time, was what they said. Republicans should also understand there is a palpable perception amongst voters that their majority status in Washington renders them responsible. This is something that Democrats always had to contend with under Obama as well. GOP voters, they say, are more likely to blame their own party than Democrats are. Of the people surveyed, 33% of GOP voters would blame Republicans, 22% would say they would blame Democrats. Democrats say that they have been banking their shutdown strategy on a thesis that voters will blame the party in power. Democratic leaders have seen a similar trend across their polling and heard from voters on the ground. They are in charge. They have the House, they have the Senate, they have the presidency. That means that they're the ones who have to push the government. And then finally, the Democrats finally centered on the healthcare issue as one that is the most poll tested for what they eventually come around to. There's a couple of big question marks here for shutdown politics. First is who gets the initial blame. Now, initially, from what I remember covering the first shutdown under Donald Trump in 2018, it was kind of like relatively equal. What eventually became a problem for Trump was a 35-day shutdown is even though it was the Christmas season, people get sick of not having government services. And, you know, the federal government is the largest employer in the United States, which means that some 2 million people were going without pay for a month, especially during the Christmas season, right? And so it was starting to have all kinds of problems, and people were getting real sick of it, and that's eventually why Trump caved. So it's actually a real question on the Democratic side of whether they can stand up to a different administration this time around, which is basically going to use it as carte blanche to do whatever they want. Now, the Democratic base, I think, is probably radicalized enough to say Trump is going to do whatever he wants anyways, so don't cave. The Republican base also is one which is like, hey, great, we can continue to do mass deportation and fund the military. We don't give a shit about the Department of Education or the Department of Transportation. The risk will be probably something external. I mean, we're going into hurricane season, so you've got this whole National Weather Service problem, which was already having issues going into this. You just never know what some sort of external event could force it. And that's when the shutdown politics can become very dangerous. There's also, we've always, people always point to this, but it is a real risk. Remember TSA and all these other, sometimes during shutdowns, you can have huge like airline delays, FAA, air traffic control, all kinds of crazy things can start showing up in people's lives. The National Park Service, Obama famously shut all the parks during the shutdown. So it can start to show up in your life very quickly, actually, if the administration wants it to. And that's where I just have no idea where the politics is to go. Why would the Democrats cave? They have no incentive on their base other than an institutional love for the bureaucrat, or if Trump is going to try to break them, which I would not put past the current Democratic Party. So, but I guess there's a more moderate Republican faction also, which is like, hey, a lot of normal people like government services. A lot of people use the government every single day. So you have no idea how that will look like as well. The other question is whether the Democrats will hold up troop pay. That's always a big one. They probably won't. Everyone almost always funds the troops. There's like certain things like that. The question is whether Republicans would allow that to go through. So there's all kinds of machinations that remain on the
and
horizon.
who doesn't get paid, who would likely be essential and continue working but doesn't get paid would be ICE. So
they definitely are going to keep
Democrats
working.
definitely, have taken note of the fact that the ICE thugs in the street would not be getting paid.
Yeah, but they're going to get their back pay eventually whenever it comes back.
That's not fun to miss your paycheck for a while. For
no, it certainly isn't. Keep in mind, though, that they're not going to fire them. Any of these namby-pambies who are working in the DOE, you people are the ones who are going to be out on the streets.
They're already out. So
not all of them.
Education has already been broadly shut down. I mean, but that gets to the point of like the Democratic base. The Democratic leadership has tried to split the difference between what they think is the most politically palatable, broad message around a shutdown that puts Republicans on the most defensive and what the base actually wants. What the base actually wants, yes, they care about healthcare. Well, what they really feel like is you should not be funding a fascist government. They would like to see conditions like the National Guard needs to be withdrawn. ICE agents need to be required to have their faces revealed and not be masked up. They want to see those sorts of, NSPM 7 needs to be rolled. Like those sorts of checks on the Trumpian authoritarian crackdown is what the base actually wants.
Yeah, but that's not going to happen, right?
Well, but
they're not in power. power. Like, it's like you lost the election, you have a minority status. Like,
I'm
why
just
would they agree?
explaining what the view is,
Okay,
Saagar.
sure,
So
yeah.
that's where the base is.
Okay.
The leadership is saying, like, we want to find the most poll-tested, friendly way to go about this that's going to put the GOP in the most difficult position. That's why they've settled on healthcare. There's an irony here, too, because actually, Republicans, in a sense, would be doing themselves some favors to just go ahead and fund this healthcare stuff that the Democrats want, because it's a genuine political problem for them that you have massive Medicaid cuts in the big beautiful bill. You have, rural hospitals, many of them threatened with closure because of the funding cuts there, and then you have these skyrocketing premiums in the ACA that is going to hit some 20 million plus Americans at the end of this year. So that is coming really soon, before the midterm elections. So there are a number of Republicans who look at this landscape and are like, we actually do need to do something about healthcare. But their argument, you even heard it there from J.D. Vance, of like, oh, well, we can negotiate for it outside of this. You shouldn't be using the shutdown to get your healthcare way. But in any case, that's what makes it a difficult political question for them, because it is actually a problem for them politically that people's healthcare costs are going to be going up and their local rural hospitals are going to be threatened with closure because of the actions that they've taken. Now, do I think that means that Republicans are going to like cave on that? No, not at all. But it is an intelligent place for Democrats to sort of like place their chips in terms of the messaging. I think the natural political landscape sort of favors Democrats, number one, because they're not in power, and number two, because people associate shutdown politics and chaos more with the Republican side. But Republicans and Trump are much more effective messengers, much more disciplined messengers. They have much more backbone. They're much more clear. They're much more willing to, they're better at this, right? So that gives them, that's why it becomes kind of a toss-up who's ultimately going to win in the battle of public opinion, because Democrats have some natural advantages here, but they have Chuck Schumer as a leader who is already, his denials notwithstanding, already trying to look for a way, an escape hatch out of this, where he can look like he put up some sort of a fight, but didn't rock the boat too much in a way that is uncomfortable for him as someone who is not a boat rocker.
Obviously, I'm biased, but to me, Jeffries and Schumer just look incredibly weak. Like, and I think a lot of the Democratic, like, to me, I
think that's just a factual.
Okay.
I don't even think that's bias. I think that's just factual.
Because the healthcare, the way they're talking about it, I'm like, oh, God, just shut up. It just looks like it came out of some polling memo that was put on your desk. I don't know. I just think that, and at the end of the day, I mean, look, I get it, like, oh, we want to, stop ICE. It's like, well, win an election. Well, it's not going to happen. So, like, that's where it just seems that the Democratic base, I don't know. I mean, in some ways, it's a lot like the Republican base back in the 2000s, where Obama what did he say to Eric Cantor? He said, elections have consequences, famously during a shutdown fight. In a way, that's true. It's like, dude, if you lose the election, you can't just come around demanding that the country be run exactly the way that you want it to be run.
On the other hand, they got a lot of what they wanted out of those shutdown fights. I mean, do you remember the whole, what was it called, budget sequestration?
But that's not what they wanted, per se.
But they were out of power, right? In even more dramatic. I mean, they were out of power in a more dramatic way than the Democrats even are right now, and they still were able to effectuate some of their goals and get some of what they wanted by using these power politics. Because the reality is Republicans do need Democrats in order to fund the government.
Yes, that's right.
Now, the other dynamic to keep in mind here is, like, there are some Democrats. So part of the reason why Schumer immediately came out after the backlash and was like, oh, I don't want a 7 to 10 day CR, wasn't because of what the base wants. It's because there were Democrats, elected Democrats, in the House and in the Senate that were like, what the hell are you doing? Yeah. Absolutely not. And so, but you only need 7 Senate Democrats to be able to pass this bill.
It's just not that many.
So if you can make a few of them a little nervous, that's all you really need as a Republican to be able to ultimately get this done. So, the fact that Schumer's already looking for the escape hatch here and trying to figure out how to back down from the shutdown threats, I think is very revealing, even though he's now denying this particular mechanism is on the table.
It also gets to my grassroots point that I made yesterday. I don't see, are there groups out there calling for a shutdown?
Yeah.
So, because but not in a high-profile way, right? Like, this is the thing people need to remember. During the Obama administration, when those Republicans were going for a shutdown, it was imagine like Fox News, you know, the entire Tea Party apparatus, all of the conservative radio hosts across the country, Eric Erickson, Rush Limbaugh, all these people, it was one message: shut it down, shut it down. Like they had the apparatus, they had the calls. I don't see that right now. Maybe I'm biased. You know, obviously I don't watch MSNBC. I don't engage as much, but even the liberal pundit class, I don't see in a full-throated way. I mean, we had Ezra Klein, for example. Remember, he's like, well, I think shutdowns are terrible, but, you know, maybe we should shut it down to show. It's like, dude, what? Just say shut it down. Like, it's a much more clear message. Like the pundit class, I don't see the MSNBC class and others united in a fervent message discipline. That's kind of why I would put my money on the Republicans for this one, because they're clear. They're like, look, we want to fire these people. We're just going to fire them. And so, you know, at the end of the day, we're going to call your bluff. You people love bureaucrats so much. Come and save them then, you know, if you want to come and fund the government. I would probably put my money on that. Well,
and this is where it gets back to what I was saying about what the base actually wants them to fight on.
Yeah.
And so I think you're right that there's definitely not as much of an organized and like clear, like, you know, the Tea Party position was oftentimes, you know, completely unreasonable. They wanted things like balanced budget amendments and we're not going to increase the deficit or the debt whatsoever. And this is all just like preposterous given the basic math of what was going on here. But they were sort of locked into a clear goal and they had organized around it and they had Tea Party movements across the country and all of that. And you're right, the similar like parallel organizations and institutions don't exist on the Democratic side right now. And I think that some of the energy that could be around the shutdown fight is also undercut by the fact that rather than the leadership going for the things that the Democratic base really wants, which is, like I said, to stand up against some of the like authoritarian overreach, the National Guard in the cities and things like that. It's sort of because it's this like poll-tested healthcare thing. Again, not to say it's not important, not to say that people don't care at all. That's just not the thing that is highly motivating the Democratic base right now.
Right.
And so that also saps some of the energy that they could be getting from the grassroots around a strategy. Whereas if they were, you know, if they were going more in that direction, I think you would see more of that like organic support. The other thing I would say is like they just didn't particularly message around this at all until like 3 days ago. So, you know, that makes it difficult to rally grassroots-based support when they don't know what you want, where you are. Like there is no leadership coming from the top of the Democratic Party for people then to rally around.
I just don't get the Democrats. I really don't. Because Mitch McConnell.
Neither do I.
It's like, what are you guys doing? Mitch McConnell, the most honest thing he ever said in what was it, 2009, right after Obama's inauguration, and they're like, are you going to work with Obama? And he's like, no, I have one job. It's to make sure he doesn't get reelected. That's it. That's the whole job. It's so, that's why balance, but it's all bullshit, okay? Like, it was all just wrapped up, as many Democrats said at the time. They don't actually care about any of this. Yeah, you're right. They wanted to wound the president. They wanted to inflict pain on the administration and to make sure that they caved in some way so that the Republican base could feel like they were doing something about it. That's it. I mean, I'm not quite sure yet what the base is so animated about. In terms of my neighborhood, the no king signs are everywhere. That seems to be like the uniting thing. Fine, whatever. But my point is just when you look at Chuck Schumer and all of those people, they don't talk that way. Like, you know, they're poll testing. They're not coming out and being like, we hate Trump, you hate Trump, we're going to do everything in our power to make his life hell. That seems to be that's the uniting message, right?
Correct.
If you're a Democratic base.
Yeah, correct.
That, you know, if you're an anti-ICE poster and you're some no kings boomer lady who lives in my neighborhood, there you go. You're together, right? On that one. It's the most uniting message. And yet they're like, it's not just the poll testing. I don't know. I just see such lack of organization. I also see lack of stars. Where is Buttigieg? You know, he's doing Andrew Callahan's Patreon, you know, and the guy, we don't even have to hear what he has to say. Where is Chris Murphy? I just interviewed the guy. He's made a couple of comments. He's not on MSNBC the way that Mike Lee and Ted Cruz were. I mean, these guys were firebrands. Emily, by the way, did an incredible monologue with her and I on the show about the shutdown fight. And she pulled a bunch of clips back from 2013. Everyone should go watch that if you're interested, to mirror what the successful playbook was and how they were able to rise to stardom.
Yeah.
I don't see a single Democratic senator doing any of that.
That's a good point.
I'm like, where
that's a good point.
is the leadership? Like, where, even Bernie, where are you, dude? Like, you should be laying stuff out, barnstorming, podcast scene, everything should be united around this. things are disparate. You know, you said indivisible. I didn't even know. I definitely knew that about the Tea Party groups. Remember the Moms Against Obama? You know, like all moms for whatever organization. I'm even blanking on these names. It's been so long.
That, but I mean, the Tea Party chapters were genuinely like across the country.
Yeah.
Your point about the stars is an interesting one too. And this again comes from the very poll-tested, like, let me let me sort of triangulate what the best place is for us to make our stand. Because then you don't necessarily have people in the coalition, like elected leaders in the coalition who are like, this is my thing, this is where I'm gonna make my stand, et cetera. And so in the Tea Party era, you had Ted Cruz, you had Mike Lee, you had, Paul Ryan was there in the mix, Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, like you knew who these people were. And they were constant, hardline spokespeople rallying the troops to the cause. And you don't have anything really approaching that on the Democratic side, partly because they were very unified behind two things. One, let's just fuck up Barack Obama's presidency. And number two, like this fiscal austerity thing that, of course ends up being nonsense. But that's what they were all very committed to at that moment, right? And you just don't have that same sort of direction within the Democratic Party where the leadership is aligned with what the base wants and is consistently messaging on, a few core things that the base really wants to see them fight on, even if they know that it's kind of like a losing battle. I think you're right, that really the energy is just they want to make things difficult for them.
That's right.
They want to put them in a difficult position and for their leadership to get caught fighting. And that has yet to happen.
Look, I mean, you can't absolve, I just checked Bernie's timeline. He doesn't have a single tweet about shutdown. Like, what are we doing here? Like, where are you people? You're not on TV? Like, AOC, all of them. I don't know what it is. It's like some weird Norm's brain virus that has infected all of them where they've attacked it's like they don't want to be called out for hypocrisy. By the way, guys, I don't even think JD would care about saying this. He was tweeting about shutdowns 2 years ago.
Right.
He was like, why wouldn't we use shutdown to compel? Why wouldn't we use the power that we have to shut down the government?
How could they use the shutdown about leverage? Like, how dare they?
Right. Nobody's going to be like, oh, but the hypocrisy.
The hypocrisy politics they're dead.
Right.
Not everyone's a hypocrite.
Get over it.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. They don't care about that. So why do you? Where are you? I don't know. If I was one of those, boomer women who I live around, I would be so mad at Chuck Schumer and all those people right now.
They are.
Like, what are you doing?
Well, and that's the thing is they are. Yeah. That's what's really different right now is people really liked Nancy Pelosi. Like the Democratic base really liked Nancy Pelosi, and listen, in her absence, she's way better than Hakeem Jeffries, I can tell you that.
Yeah,
as a strategist, as a spokesperson, as someone who has the appearance of a spine, like she was a much more effective leader. No doubt about that. And it just, I don't know, there was a different moment. Now there is a real sense that the Democratic leadership has capitulated, that they've led them, them off a cliff, that they have decided just to like curl up in fetal position rather than fighting, as Trump has ramped up his attacks in a much more aggressive way than we ever saw in Trump 1.0. And so there is a complete disgust and fury at Democratic leadership right now that is so different within the Democratic base. And that is going to express itself in some places. I don't know if it's, I don't think it's going to be in the shutdown fight, but down the road in primaries, in terms of 2028, the direction of the party, there is no doubt that rage and disgust that the Democratic base has with their own leadership is going to be expressed and have consequences at some point, which is why Schumer's doing this, because he knows on some level that their grip on the power within their own party is at stake right now if they don't at least appear to try to do a little bit of something.
He's looking a lot like John Boehner to me right now, so we'll see. Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.